I'm an executive director for EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. This is a discussion today with some wonderful authors who are part of our The Political Librarian journal, the fall 2024 issue of The Political Librarian. We want to be able to highlight here at the EveryLibrary Institute some of the good thinking that's going on, some of the research and discovery that's happening in our sector, and some of the conversations that need to be pushed from behind, perhaps, or dragged along, because there's a lot of things in library land where we have talking points, and we spend a lot of time, celebrating libraries and getting loud for libraries, but really, there's some very significant policy issues roiling the United States, our friends in Canada, the Western world right now, around big issues like censorship. Censorship, both as a form of limits on access, as well as a form of discrimination and erasure. We've invited several of our authors from the Political Librarian, which is our open access online journal. It's published at least twice a year these days. It is hosted at Washington University in St. Louis for the benefit of the profession and scholars everywhere at thepoliticallibrarian.org. We've invited several of them to share about their articles, and I'm going to ask you, as the watcher here, the listener here, to not only spend a little time with us in conversation, but to go back to the issue and dive in deep. I want to bring in our series editor, our editor-in-chief, Andrew Sulavik, for a little bit of a preview on the issue itself and our colleagues here who we're going to be meeting today. So, Andrew, thank you for being part of this conversation today, and thank you for ably shepherding that issue to completion. It went to press just before the elections in November, if I recall correctly.
Right at that time, yes. We just put it out, 4 or 5 weeks ago in its full glory. So It's a good issue. It's probably one of the best that we put out with the different articles that are in it. And we continue to gain more and more authors and a greater readership. So it's gaining traction.
Yeah, it's interesting. The conversations around policy, public policy, tax policy, education policy that we've been trying to encourage. Certainly, something as big as this most recent national election puts kind of a fine point on people's thinking. In the introduction to the issue, you talk about how the national elections have brought political change and even turmoil that will likely increase the challenges to the library community. The perspectives that we're trying to bring through the Political Librarian to those challenges are both, I think, affirmative of the profession, but also in ways to help the profession discover more about itself. Did you have any surprises editing this issue, especially its proximity to the election, or any insights that you want to share about the submissions that might have stood out for you this time around?
Well, the first surprise were how many articles came in, first of all, and the variety and depth of them. Each contributed to, I think, what made for a really good collage for our readership. I don't see the Political Librarian as a journal that's written by specialists for specialists, although there are articles that do that in this case. But it's also written for everybody, for the common librarian, the common person walking into the library, anybody interested in the culture wars that are going on today. That's what I liked about this issue. I kind of intentionally put a kind of structure, and I didn't put that in my introduction, but if you look at the order of the articles, I subliminally or purposely put them in a certain order. Starting at the top of censorship, which is always going to be at the top of the list, unfortunately, and one that I fear is going to be a growing and contentious issue. And we move through a favor of mine. I come from an academic background deeply, and how that culture war it has new ground, it is gaining ground within academic libraries. Often, most people are hearing it's in the public school libraries, but it's now becoming quite a threat in the university level from that article. That was a very good article. And then we worked down K through 12. If you look at the education, almost from graduate school down to K through 12. But that next article and how inadvertently the political actions that politicians take, they have no idea of how that trickles down into the vendor world and how you can't disentangle databases, and how it's difficult to not only disentangle or to, how should I say, segregate information in an integrated database for particular users. That begins to crumble and become a real challenge for vendors. Or on another point, how 17, 16-year-olds going onto a college campus have to access databases. And colleges can't seem to handle that because they're in another age group. So it poses more problems that we need to be alert to that are being created. I liked the Tip O'Neill was right by Sherry Henry very much. We need more engagement with society. And the articles then start to turn to what we need to do, how we need to speak, not only to our own groups, but the people within a village area, I'd like to say, closer around us, and get out there and engage if we can, as much as we can as librarians, because it is all local. We lose the focal point thinking, well, we have a new president, all the powers that be in Washington have so much over our lives. Not necessarily so. Let's just start in our own area and work our way out. I like that article for that reason. It brings us back to that basic truth. The levy campaign, we're going down into what I see as practical layers that our journal offers. One of the big threats to the libraries now is, cutting funding. And what are we going to do? And we need to be mindful of where the money's coming from and defend that ground and know how to do it well. So that was originally a guide, and I'm glad that we published that out to help others. And I think it'll be very useful because that can be difficult. And the last two are from experience articles, I call them, and I think they're equally important. They weren't highly academic, and they weren't meant to be, but reminders of what people have gone through, both in the past, in a warning from East Berlin on book censorship. What can happen to us if we lower our guard or not observant or kind of missing the moment? And I think that's another point of the Political Librarian. We have to help our viewership not miss the moment. The most important thing we can do is what we're going to do next, and just keep that in mind in the forefront of what we're doing. And it's not necessarily looking back and saying that it's right behind us. It could be right in front of us. Things to come. And I'm not out there and I don't think these articles are there to frighten people as much as to remind people that it could happen here. And then finally, The Conflict by Lacey Sutherland, who actually lost her job. She had nothing to lose at this point. People are afraid to write. I'm getting people that want to be anonymous now. That's not a good sign. But I liked how brave she was. She put her name on it. Of course, she lost her job. She stood up against people that will destroy you almost if you stand up for the principles of librarianship, basically. I can't say that she did anything wrong. I'm not, and I feel terribly she had lost her job, but I wasn't going to let her lose her story. And we gave her voice to that story. She paid a high price. And I hope people will read that and take note that you may be in a really blue state and you may be really safe because the politics around you are safe and the community and what you believe are safe. But once you start going into some of the red states, I'm from Connecticut, I'm in Florida, guess what? It could get rough. Not everything will mesh. And you've got to tread lightly and be smart about your next move in how you either operating ethically as a librarian or legally or on whatever level politically.
Andrew, thanks for the rundown there. And I think the approach to structuring the issue, it's almost like building an album rather than a whole bunch of singles, and I dig that. We have our next call for up right now. We're recording early February 2025. We'd like to be able to be out in the winter, late fall, early winter of 2020. Wait, yeah, I'm doing that right. Yeah, late fall of 2025 becomes the winter, right before the new year. We have our call for papers out. Andrew, you mentioned before about taking anonymous submissions, and I think that's a nice thing that we're doing, an appropriate thing that we've been doing for years. Philosophically, who are you hoping to show up for this issue? Who should be listening for this call for?
Oh boy, I would like to see a little bit more articles on the whole concept of neutrality. What does it mean? It's really at the nexus of a lot of the arguments and discussions that we're having and have been having since Trump was first elected for the last 8 to 10 years. There have been some good articles, but I don't think there's enough about that. And what does it mean? And both practically and philosophically, but also would love to have articles at a very high level of essays and also very practical. We have internal discussions about this all the time in collection development in my library, I know. And I think if that's happening at a public library level, I know it's happening in the academic level. I don't even have to go there. That says a lot that it's filtered down to this point. I'd like to see that and get feedback to, be a touchstone for what's happening around the country. If people could give us more stories of what's really happening, because there's a lot of denial out there lately, if you notice. This book banning is not happening. It's the latest one. Mm-hmm. Let us know what's happening. If you could write it compellingly, please send it in. And if it is that you feel at your own risk, we'll take it anonymously.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. So it's opinion pieces, it's white papers, it's longer essays, and it's the anonymous opportunity as well. So, Andrew, I'm going to thank you very much for taking us through the front matter, as it were, of this. And I want to get into these conversations now with our colleagues around the work that they've done. I'm going to bring you in at the end again for a little recap. Okay?
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Be right back to you. All right, team. Let me do a little bit of the changing room here, which is always, like the most awkward part of any live event. But I'm going to bring in Michael Nyby. Michael is, along with his colleague, Richard. Yep, this is where I got wrong. I need to get it right. There we go. I did it, Michael. I did it. Michael, with his colleague Richard Ellis, who's not with us today, wrote a wonderful paper for this issue of the Political Librarian called "A Confluence of Trends in Library Censorship." Michael is chair of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Intellectual Freedom Committee. You might be our first political librarian submission from outside of the United States, and it's a real trouble. Hey. Yeah. So one of the reasons
what an honor.
Yeah, one of the reasons we were so excited to publish you, and one of the reasons I'm very excited to talk to you today, is that you're taking a look in A Confluence of Trends in Library Censorship to the nature of library censorship efforts that are different historically, but are finding a meeting point now between the United States and Canada.
A confluence, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned in the paper that prior to the COVID pandemic, that it was different. The United States modalities in that 2015 to 2021 period of censorship were different than the Canadian modalities of censorship. But now, coming through the pandemic and in the current political moment, can you describe a little bit about your findings here?
Absolutely. So this research dates back to actually a couple of articles ago when I started looking at the data that we've collected in Canada, starting from 2015. The most reliable sort of geographically disaggregated data that I had available starts at 2015. So that's where I started my research. The year 2015 is important here because it coincided with the release of what in Canada is something that's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. For those of you who are not familiar, this was a fairly large initiative by our federal government to examine the injustices that have precipitated upon the Indigenous people in Canada by the colonial settler culture that has, of course, overtaken our part of the continent. This was a report that really opened up, I think, a lot of people's eyes to the various kinds of ongoing injustices that Indigenous people in Canada are still suffering from. And it was a a fairly big watershed moment in our culture. And so as a result, if you look at the library challenges that we had between 2015 and through 2021, the most common manifestation of a challenge in a library would be to materials that were perceived to be racist, and the large majority of them were materials that were perceived to be racist or discriminatory against Indigenous people. A lot of books with cultural appropriation, name calling, various things like that, cultural stereotypes, negative cultural stereotypes, and that was sort of our primary theme. And we can contrast that to what we saw in the United States throughout that same period of time, 2015 to 2021. The United States, the challenges that they're experiencing now are fairly similar to what they were experiencing in that time period as well, with the exception of now there are certain issues that are a bit more magnified. So it was quite a large difference that we saw between what was going on in the US and Canada, and that was a little surprising to me. Although I didn't have the opportunity to write about this until the EveryLibrary's white paper on the demographics of book bans came out in the past year, at which point I had a discussion with Patrick Sweeney from the EveryLibrary Institute about the research that I had done from a demographic standpoint in Canada. And he asked if I would be willing to do a presentation at the Library Advocacy and Funding Conference on what's happened in Canada versus what's happening in the US. And I said, sure, why don't I write a paper? And here we are. So what we found after using all of the data that we've collected at the CFLA and getting access to some of the ALA's data as well, what I was able to find was that after 2021, 2022 is when we saw a really big change in the kinds of challenges that were happening in the U.S., the volume of challenges that were happening in the U.S., and that's when we saw this magnification of certain issues that I referred to earlier. First, we saw a big uptick in challenges to any kind of material that had a pro-LGBTQIA plus viewpoint, and a big uptick in materials that had anything to do with racial justice, racial inequity, or the history of racism in United States culture. It took about a year for a similar sort of manifestation to happen in Canada. We didn't really get a big uptick in challenges till 2022, and happened in 2021 in the US. And we never really got a big uptick in challenges to materials dealing with racial equity, but we did see a huge uptick in challenges to anything that was pro-LGBTQIA. Whereas in the period before this, we would actually receive far more challenges to materials that were perceived to be homophobic or transphobic. In particular, as an example here, the most challenged title in the history, the whole history that we've been collecting this data, is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, which is a book that many people feel denies the existence of transgender youth to begin with, and many people feel like it is very harmful to transgender communities. That book has been challenged more than any other book in Canadian history. And actually, it still does get quite a few challenges. However, by volume, now books that look at LGBTQIA plus issues in a positive light are getting challenged by far greater proportion of our total than anything that is perceived to be homophobic or transphobic. We haven't. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, so what's driving the change? So the fact that there's been, the 2021 election cycle, which is an off cycle in the United States. I mean, there's a few governor's races, there's a few state House and Senate races, was a laboratory for using book bans as a political conversation. What pivoted in Canada in 2022 then to move from that racial equity conversation to this more charged around LGBTQ plus?
Well, frankly, I think we have to go back a couple of years to 2020 because that was COVID. And the entire COVID period really energized a lot of reactionary political groups. And there's one group in particular I'd want to point out here is a group called Action for Canada. Action for Canada has been around since the late teens. They're a sort of I'm editorializing here a little bit. I wouldn't put this in a paper without citing it, but it's a Christo-fascist organization that has been pushing for a more traditionalist take on Canadian culture, traditionalist from a white Christian point of view, for a while, and they took COVID as an opportunity to really gain a lot of followers, because there's a large portion of their followers are, I would say, conspiracy minded. After the resistance to vaccines was no longer a big selling point, which I'd say 2022 maybe was about that point, we started to see some restrictions lifted. We were starting to get out of the COVID period, and I think that Action for Canada was able to see the success of organizations like Moms for Liberty in the U.S., and then took on a similar activist role, organizational role, in encouraging their followers to protest library drag story times. They had a list of titles that they deemed. And these are very, very innocent titles, like And Tango Makes Three, for instance, that has no sexuality in it whatsoever. It doesn't even have humans in it, right? It's just penguins. And you take all of these books and they put them on a list, and they would say that these books are grooming and sexualizing children in this kind of hateful language. This list was actually directly pulled right from a school curriculum. They didn't even curate this list themselves. They just pulled it directly from a province-wide school curriculum from BC. And as a result, all of these libraries across Canada started getting all kinds of challenges to these books, and not just your kind of formal challenge where the complainant follows the library policy and fills out a request for reconsideration. No, these were protests. These were people going in and angrily yelling at a library tech working circulation counter. I have even one instance of somebody flushing a book down a toilet in the ladies' room, and of course the kinds of near violent protests that we had to drag story times. This kind of resistance was organized over social media, and really energized a lot of people to leave their own home communities to protest libraries in other communities, bringing this kind of resistance nationwide. And we found that it was a fairly flat level of resistance in almost all of our provinces, with the exception of Quebec, where things are always a little bit different. So I really think COVID was the big turning point here. It was COVID really energized these groups, and then following what happened in the United States by similar organizations there, they were able just to copy the playbook and bring a similar sort of resistance and opposition to Canadian libraries. It's
fascinating to me that when you think about in the UK, you've got your Reagan and Thatcher, as sort of that touchstone of we're going to feed each other different ideas. We're going to workshop those different ideas. You've got your former your Trudeau the Elder, with other progressives in the. I mean, the back and the forth is driven by social media. But it's really a politicized conversation in very dramatic ways on both sides of the border. Last question for you, real quick, is in the United States, we know from the research paper that we did last year on the demographics of book ban towns, that the towns that are experiencing this have two characteristics. One is that they have had a big fight recently, the masking fight, the trans bathroom policy fight, Title IX sports fights, women's sports fights. It's not the town has been fighting for a long time. And it tends to be whiter, more educated, a little bit more provincial when it comes to NIMBY issues. They don't want, it seems like it's an exclusionary policy to have book bans and censorship. What's the demographic trends in your neck of the woods?
I'm so glad you asked, because the organizations that have been pushing this kind of resistance in Canada have been so effective that the areas that are most affected by this movement, Well, it's all areas, to be honest with you. And in fact, because I had this demographic data from a previous paper, I could use it and just and compare it to current demographic data. And I specifically looked just at the LGBTQIA plus challenges on this, and we found that in the pre-2021 time period, pre-2022 time period, we wouldn't see a lot of challenges to LGBTQIA materials in large cities, in highly educated cities, and places that voted for, places that voted for the Liberal Party of Canada. They were actually fairly uncommon there, but they were quite common in places that voted Conservative, smaller cities, and places with lower educational attainment. Mm-hmm. When we look at all of those demographic dimensions again in the 2022, 2023, and 2024 time periods, we see that it has flattened out, and the rate is the national rate of challenges of this type of material holds true within single percentage points across almost all demographic categories. And the other incredible thing that came of this is that we were also able to just tally the number of challenges that happened in the US and in Canada, individual challenges that happened in both countries, and extrapolate them out to the population. And we were able to find that in 2023, challenges were happening in Canadian libraries at a higher rate than they were in the United States. And for years, Canadian libraries would watch what was going down. Library workers would watch what was going on down in the United States. And I would hear, well, you know what, yeah, things are getting bad here, but at least it's not as bad as there. Well, it turns out it's actually worse here. Or at least I should say the data indicates it's actually worse here. Mm-hmm. And something that I just want to point out is that the ALA has very, very commonly publishes their estimate that only between 3 and 18% of challenges that actually happen are reported. In one of our studies that we did on our committee a couple years ago, or last year rather, we did a survey and we found that the rate in Canada is probably about the same. So we can do better, and we do need that better data so that we can have better information going into this.
Michael, that's a fascinating set of findings, and something that perks my interest in reading your article in depth. Folks, I want to invite you to do the same thing at the politicallibrarian.org. What Michael and Richard have put together is a very deep and detailed and true story that I think is illustrative of, we are all in this together. There's a culture of reading. There's a culture around libraries, and there's a political conversation happening in North America that I think that we have to be engaged in a particularly in a new way in this new political moment. So, Michael, thank you for your time on this today. Hang out a little bit. We'll see if we can't bring you in at the end for a once around and a goodbye. So
happy to. Okay,
cheers. All right, team. I'm going to move on to our other guests. We have 3 wonderful writers who I've had the pleasure to collaborate with a little bit on the development of their paper, which is in the current issue of the Political Librarian. We have Connie Williams, Joe Mendelson, and Marianne Harlan. They have written a wonderful but long title, which I'm going to put on the screen, unlike what I just did to Michael, Access to Online Subscription Content in K-12 through Schools Through the School Library. Well, team, this is a really interesting paper, in my opinion, because there's a lot of focus on book bans. It's called book bans. Censorship is not exclusively around banning or removing a physical item from the library, and I'm not talking about ebook versions either. What you're dealing with here is censorship around whether it's active censorship or quiet censorship around the backbone of the academic resources that exist in K-12 spaces. These are databases that are usually purchased either for the school or by the school or for all the schools in the state, perhaps by a state library. And there's been some real problems that you've done some extraordinarily original work around identifying those problems. What brought us together was a conversation about stop words and about that kind of quiet censorship that happens when you cannot search. As a student, you can't search some bad words, perhaps, but there's also plenty of common words that need to exist for health and for health classes and for English classes and for history classes. And how big of a problem is it? How bad is this out there?
I would say it's pretty bad. I can give 2 examples from my own students who were working on projects, and I had one who was a transgender student who wanted to research transgender and mental health, and he couldn't find anything. And he came to me and he said, "There's nothing in the databases," and I was like, "Yeah, there is. Like, how is there not?" you know. And I started searching and I was like, oh, no. So what that student wound up doing was not using the databases. So that's a problem. We're paying a lot of money for these databases. Another student wanted to write about sexual harassment, but because of the stop word sex, sexual harassment, you could only find harassment. So everything she was finding was about harassment and not sexual harassment. And she actually decided not to research that topic, which I think is a real shame because she was interested in that.
So the idea that some words should not be searched for, some words should not be available, has extended into. Is it the sophistication of the database search engines that's a problem, or is it the concerns of educators and parents that's really driving this situation?
I actually think it's these are historical, right? Those of us who have been around long enough remember when we had filters that over-filtered. And this stop word lists, there's 2 problems that we sort of see with them. One is that we don't know what they are. And so it is very, like, you have to be an expert searcher to notice that it's searching for harassment only and not sexual harassment. It's this tiny little print that you're like, oh, like if you don't know that. And, most students aren't going to notice that. So not knowing what those words are makes it really difficult. But it's also a historical problem. Those stop word lists, they go way back to when we first started thinking about how we had to filter the internet. I can't remember the legal case, unfortunately, that got challenged and brought down before the Children's Internet Protection Act came into place, which does state schools have to filter and databases do as well. So it's a little bit of a combination. The historical nature of those stop word lists that haven't been updated and that do come from sort of this notion that we have to protect our students from information that might be inappropriate, whatever that word means, whoever that means. But it's also, you do have the technology to do those types of filters with these databases. So to some extent, yes, it's the sophistication, but I think it's much more of a long-term historical problem that we've been seeing.
So there's a difference between searching on the open web, which is covered by the Children's Internet Protection Act. If you take E-rate money, you have to filter. There's a difference between that searching the open web and these academic databases. And I would think that there's got to be a huge difference in terms of the content of academic databases based on grade level and the kind of courses. And yet there's a drive, it sounds like, to the bottom, to the least offensive and to the least troubling stop words. How prevalent is this around the country? Do you see things differently on one side of the country than another? Is this a red state, blue state issue? Or is this something that's happening across academia?
The stop words happen across academia, but attempts to filter databases look like the book bans at the legislative level, a red state, blue state issue. So, for example, in Texas, the state library RFPs for these databases have an NDA attached to them. So we don't know what the state of Texas is asking to be taken out of their databases, whereas the state of California is looking for transparency. So we know what the stop words are or what's being taken out of databases. So there is a red state, blue state issue, but stop words is much more of a vendor. approach. So that happens across the United States.
Which also then drives the idea of if they create stop words for one state, they're actually creating it for everyone. So it does become a state by state issue, but it also is a national issue in terms of what is that database vendor going to be able to offer across the board to all their students across the country.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So in county, we know very clearly that there are some places that have certified school librarians in them and some places that don't. Are you seeing that that schools with certified school librarians, they're a little more successful around not working around stop words, but helping students with their information literacy skills? Or is this a situation that's being imposed, like in Texas, with the way they're writing RFPs?
Well, I think we're talking apples and oranges there.
Okay.
Where we've got, if you have a paraprofessional running a school library, for example, they are not instructing. They can help students get to the databases. Most likely the databases are offered through their state or a district or a larger organization, and they're not choosing them themselves because that's not within their purview as a paraprofessional. So those students don't get that instruction unless they get it through their classroom teachers. Those schools that have a credentialed teacher librarian, as we call them in California, or a school librarian credentialed, has access to the person to teach them how to use those databases, regardless of whether they come to them through their own purchasing locally or whether they come through a purchase through the state or a district. So yes, there's two different aspects to that at that point.
Mm-hmm. So Joe, how does this? So we're talking about research databases. What for the average non-school librarian? You hear the word database, you think about a spreadsheet in Excel. Really, what's underneath the hood here?
So research databases contain articles that from a variety of publications that are then made searchable through this database. Sometimes a database will have, a specific focus like history. Other times it'll be, a middle school database with general information. So we're talking about some of my kids, you have to kind of teach the kiddos that that a database is different than the internet, because a lot of times they think it's exactly the same thing. They're always surprised when I say we pay for these. But some of them seem grateful also, and I think we're kind of moving more towards grateful at this point because the internet is getting so difficult to search. But we find them very helpful, except for when we run into these problems with finding things in them that are preventable.
So we have, an issue of, there's always curation. Editors of these databases are like editors of encyclopedias. They're like editors of magazines. They found good content. It's vetted. It's educationally appropriate. It's grade level or it's subject matter relevant. And yet, and then we've got our school librarians and our educators who are in the mix to help make the crosswalk. And yet, we've got these overly, like the level of extra concern that comes in.
Yes.
Team, if we can boil it all down to sugar, where are we at with this conversation?
I'm sorry. We're losing our minds a little bit, John. I'm really sorry. We would like to make a difference between curation and database.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Okay, so databases We used the word online subscription content because some of the materials that are provided to schools are online subscription content, like Britannica, for example, which is an encyclopedia and is curated, and the videos and the articles and all of that stuff is curated by a team for grade level. We also provide to our students research databases. And the only way that we could consider that particularly curated is that they have deals with print, other media sources, and they take all of those media sources. So I'm careful to say that those are curated. They are collections of materials, and the role of the school librarian is to teach kids how to sort of deal with those collections of materials. So we're very careful about how we use curated, because the professional school librarian has some responsibility around that. So there's a little bit of a difference between, say, Britannica, or some of these subject area databases that you might see from a vendor like Gale, who's very popular in the K-12 space, and say ProQuest, who has a K-12 database, but has 12,000 journals and magazines and newspapers involved in it. So just a little quick clarification on that we happen to think is very important.
Yeah, and I do too. I appreciate you flagging this, because the conversation right now needs some precision, and the conversation needs some common definitions, because when we go to talk to a policymaker, we talk to a lawmaker, go talk to the education committee in a red state or a blue state, I'm halfway decent, even though I don't have my MLS, but I still get it wrong. And what they're trying to get right is some version of either protecting kids or social engineering. What do we have to do, if I can sum it all up with us today and boil it all down to sugar, as I was saying before, what does our profession of librarianship need to be doing at this moment of time to help either inoculate us against overreach of these kinds of restrictions on access, or to have a broader dialogue within the education sector? What should we be talking about?
We should be talking about hiring teacher librarians. I mean, seriously, that's the bottom line to the whole thing. You running a school library needs to have that instructor that resides on site or through close availability to teach kids how to use these materials. The databases, the purchased online subscription has content that provides value to the school, provides value to the students. In the same way, online open source information provides some value, but both need to be taught, because it's that critical thinking aspect of how do I know what I am looking at is reliable, and how do I take the steps to determine that reliability. And that's the role of the teacher librarian, not as a support necessarily, but as a co-teacher, as someone who is there front and center with their classroom colleagues doing this work.
Connie, thank you for that. I appreciate that the solution to in a certain respect, a technology problem is a human being. That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes with me talking through access to online subscription content in K-12 schools through the school library, and also giving me a little bit of schooling myself.
Sorry.
I'm encouraging everybody here who's watching today and listening to dive into this issue of the political librarian and taking a look at some of your findings. There is a big conversation to be had right now, and I think you've done some extraordinary work in this digital censorship space. So thank you for sharing it with me today and our readers in the issue.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm going to start removing you politely and gently, and make sure that I can clear the deck here so that our colleague Sherry Henry can come on and have a nice chat about her work. Sherry Henry, and I we go back a little ways, Sherry. And
we do. Williamsburg. I remember exactly the place.
yes, and part of the meet cute of a place like Williamsburg, Virginia, is it's redolent with history,
Yep.
and the opportunity to talk to you over the years and collaborate with you both when you were at Urban Libraries Council and now when you're back in library land, is to have a conversation about the relevance of politics. Your article, Tip O'Neill was right, the power of local politics. I mean, I think about Tip O'Neill quite a bit these days in America. It's February 2025, and him and Reagan sitting around, actually making policy happen. I didn't agree with everything that came out of there. I was only 10, 12 years old at the time. But the idea that we could start working from a place of at least common cause or common concern for us. I mean, your article here talks about his all politics is local. We are in a very different political climate now. I mean, politics is waging war these days, basically. So tell us a little bit about what you're trying to reflect on as a librarian in that kind of a context.
Yeah, different world. Well, I came at it two different ways in the article, as you know, where it was partly professionally what we can do. We have a lot of power. We're absolutely critical to the survival of democracy. I actually think it rises and falls with libraries in some ways right now. We're that important. And then personally, and being able to separate that, I think somebody mentioned throughout these conversations today about, the difference, maybe it was our pre-chat, between like really making sure we're being ethical, right? Like that we're ethical, that we're being professional. I do think there are things that which another person discussed, a librarian who, was fired and she was standing on principle. That's, everybody needs to know what that line is for themselves. So I really try to draw a clear line though in the article between, and really making it clear, only you can answer that for yourself. And then use your power in both of those instances. So if you want me to go from, at it from a library point of view, we are absolutely trusted cornerstones of democracy. We throw that term around a lot, but that is what we are. And when you think of a cornerstone and how foundational it is to something surviving, that concrete goes way into the ground, and we are, a lot's built on us, and we have a responsibility. So we are a gathering place. People use our meeting rooms, and that's showing the world that everyone is welcome here. You can come and discuss all sorts of ideas, and everybody might not like what you're meeting about, and they can meet about what they want to meet about. So I think that's an example. We can host all sorts of programs, literacy programs, absolutely. And also we can practice having panels and being examples of having civic dialogue. Back to your point about Reagan and Tip O'Neill, it was just a different era. I don't know that they were always perfectly civil, but they kept at it, right? They didn't walk away. They didn't separate from one another. They kept at the discussions. So I think, what's our role in reclaiming that? And I think we can do a lot in a professional space around that. And then we have display spaces, which we can use, whether it's to honor a deceased president recently, or to, we have different celebratory months, as you know, in libraries, and to make sure that whether or not, the celebratory month should be the minimum, that anyone who comes in our library sees themselves reflected, not just in the collections, but in the displays. And then the two other areas, obviously our resources, we should have something for everyone, and really something that offends everyone, quite frankly, if you're doing it right, where people can come and learn. We're responsible. We are for providing good information, which is becoming trickier and trickier. And who knew that facts would become political and politicized? So, we have some real challenges here with all of those things. But
in the article, you talk about the press and the role of the press as a watchdog, the role of the press as a reflector, the role of the press as an interpreter. But then you go on to do something which I don't think I've seen in other contexts before. You talk about libraries as the fifth part of government. Of course, you get the House, the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court. You got your fourth part, which is the press, colloquially. But why do you think that the library is that fifth part of democracy?
And if I were going to split hairs, I'd go back and change that to the fifth estate instead of the fifth branch, just to correct my own writing. But either way, to your point, because I think we are every bit as critical, and I can't see it any other way. We provide every department in local government. A lot of us are, whether you're a regional, without getting too far into the weeds on that, every department in local government, social services has their space. The police department has their space. There's very clear missions for each department in local government. And ours typically is the free, pared down, it's the free and open access for everyone to ideas and information. And that is absolutely as important to the survival of civic education, of helping to create a citizenry that's capable and knows their power and understands it, as the legislators are doing or not doing at this point. And so I will also say, I think we have seen some failure in all 4 of those other estates, and it's easy to sit and go, wow, watch them all fail. And really what I've come to do is, how are we failing, and what do we, because we have some corrections to make at this time too.
Yeah, the idea that libraries are by, for, and of local government.
Yes, perfect.
I think that there's something to be said for a perceptional situation around librarianship, though, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this just for a second, if I could. We are government. We work in government. These are government funded. They're taxpayer funded. They're within the structure of state law, even more so than anything under Congress. They're local ordinances, and yet sometimes libraries behave as if they're a nonprofit. They behave. Librarians sometimes behave as if we are the, some NGO that's doing some sort of like literacy and social justice. I mean, there's a tension right now in America about the role of government, and you've seen it. You've been in it. You've been involved in it, and you've also helped support through your time at ULC that democracy conversation. Do we need to lean in to a new definition of what it means to be working in government as libraries?
Well, I think we need to raise awareness and have those conversations. So I think those are some good future journal articles for you. And I'm not trying to put off the topic. I think it's very complicated. I think when we discuss neutrality, what does that look like? How neutral are you when it comes to human rights? Are we neutral in the First Amendment? No.
So, and then what about the 14th? Right.
And the 14th Amendment, and what does it say? And because it's pretty plain. And so I see our role, the Congress is paid by taxpayer funds. So, as far as that goes, I don't see that as much of a barrier as really understanding your locality's needs, and being respectful of that. And not necessarily identifying what you can push or not push. What does it look like to live into library values in the place you've been planted? And I think about that a lot. So, and to educate people. Let's take the 14th Amendment. Let's run with that for a second. It's very clear. It's not controversial. It's been controversial among some people over time, but rulings have been very clear on it. Anyone can read. So I think one of our roles is we can read and we encourage reading, and we can encourage people to know the words say what you think they mean. That sometimes we listen, and I'm all about experts and I want lawyers to weigh in. I want to hear how the courts have ruled. But at some point you can have an opinion, take all that into account, and the words are still there. That first sentence in the 14th Amendment doesn't leave a lot for interpretation. So I think that kind of is a great example of all of the things that we have the power to kind of affect.
That's very interesting. And I appreciate that perspective very much. The idea that we are constitutional libraries, that it's not just the First Amendment. It's nice to talk about it all and all that. But if we follow the Constitution and the Constitution of our states as well, I mean, if you're in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Kentucky aside, our states are driving what they hope government can do. And there's a certain sort of progressive neighborliness about libraries that I think is unique in our constitutional system.
Yes. And so I do think we don't need to be constitutional scholars, but we probably need to have a pretty good working relationship with the Constitution and the librarians, and certainly people in middle to upper management, as well as Civil Rights Act, major periods of history that changed the course of history, you know. And I would say, my mother used to say when I first learned to drive, I grew up in the DC area in a suburb. And when I first learned to drive and she would let us go shopping, for example, for new clothes, she'd hand me her credit card and say, you can abuse this one time. So if you do, go big. And I feel, you know, it's kind of funny, but I often think we should not abuse our power, right? That was her message to me. Don't you dare overspend. I've given you a budget. So, you know, that's something we really need to keep in mind. Don't abuse the trust and power. And it's hard right now. There need to be a lot of discussions around it.
Sherry, Henry, thank you so much for taking the time to share about the article, about some of your insights as well. Folks, I need you to go read it along with everything else on the Political Librarian. Sherry, I'm going to take you out,
Yep.
and I'm going to bring Andrew in for a little bit of a closing set of thoughts here, if that's okay with you, Andrew.
Oh, sure.
We've heard some good things today from our colleagues about the thoughtful engagement with the big issues. I know that we're looking for the next issue as well of the Political Librarian. I want to put up the call to action, or the call for papers for the special issue, which we have some guest editors who are with us on that around the present moment. But again, coming around to our next issue, which is the fall of 2025, Volume 8, Issue 2, reflecting a little bit on what you heard today, and then a call to action for the profession to respond to these ideas.
Yeah, what struck me was, especially the last discussion of us as our profession, we're mediators and important ones. And our mediation and our role with government as she was saying, as she put it, fifth estate. If you look at it, the federal government has the Library of Congress. They knew if this experiment's going to work, we better have a library. It's the first thing. Mm-hmm. And then we have state libraries, of course, and then we have libraries for everyone else. If this democracy, this experiment's going to work, libraries are truly the fifth estate. That was remarkable. I think also that we are mediators has come through too. In the other discussion, we're saying, well, we have technology and the legislation can fool with it, but you really do need an information professional to help mediate and understand and navigate through both the content and the technology. Mm-hmm. And with all the cutbacks, that's been devastating. We have to see ourselves in that role, a powerful role. And the public needs to fight for that and realize how important both a physical library is in a local community, on the national level, state level, and the librarians, the people that actually operate those libraries in mediating information. I'd like to see maybe more of that come out. We're always, I'm not going to say always, it'd be good to see some positive articles about the positive role of librarianship. It's been being assaulted. So with very little published articles to the opposite. Mm-hmm. So if someone were to come and say, wait a second here.
Yeah. Let's take a lap. I think it's about time. We've been pummeled pretty hard and fiercely, and we've been equally fighting back pretty hard as best we can. But maybe get beyond not only being reactive but proactive, and maybe putting our perspective in its own right in a very attractive light. There's nothing more compelling than that. If someone has the talent and the will to do that, that would be a great contribution at this moment. That's fantastic. All right, Andrew. Thank you very much for your insights here. To all of our colleagues for sharing about their works today. I want to put up on the screen again the link back to the Political Librarian, and go ahead and thank Michael Nyby for his time with us today on a confluence of trends in library censorship. Connie Williams, Joe Mellinson, and Marian Harlan on access to online subscription content in K-12 schools through the school library, and Sherry Henry, who's asking the big question about Tip O'Neill. Was he right? Folks, I also want to invite you to take a look at the other publishing that EveryLibrary Institute does. It's a public policy, tax policy, education policy think tank, and we like to put the think in it, not just the tank. It's not a compliment to EveryLibrary's political action committee work. In a lot of ways, and Andrew, we've talked about this before, every library is like a doctor. We come in as a political action committee. We work on one library at a time. They present a set of symptoms. You know, we have a practice, of course, so we have a lot of patience, but we're working on one library at a time. And the Institute, the EveryLibrary Institute with the Political Librarian and our other research projects is more like public health. You know, you can work on one patient's cancer, or maybe we can outlaw smoking. You know, it's a good place to be. So thank you. Thanks to our colleagues and folks. I hope you enjoy this issue and that you'll take Andrew up on his offer about publishing the next one. So thank you today. Cheers.